So what we want to do now is collect some melting point data. And I'm going to use the Mel-Temp electrothermal instrument here instead of the Thomas Hoover instrument because those are be a little easier for you to see what I'm doing. Still may not be able to get you to see inside very well. But anyway, I've got two of these set up. And I know that I want to heat this one somewhere around 80 because of vanillin's around 80. So I'm going to turn that between 0 and 1. And this one I want to get up to around 118. I'm going to turn that up to a setting of 1 and let those rise a little bit while I prepare the sample. So the vanillin, right, is already pretty finely powdered, which means I probably don't need to do very much to it to get it ready. Just kind of crunch it up a little bit. And then usually what works well to do melting points is to put a little bit on a watch glass. Generally easier to get it into a melting point capillary from off the watch glass. I'm going to grab a couple of melting point capillaries. And then you just want to put, oops, well, snap that one in half. So you just want to take the open end and kind of tap it down a little bit to get somewhere around 4 or 5 millimeters. And we'll drop this down here to let it collect at the bottom. So you can see that we've got a nice little bit of white solid down at the bottom of the melting point capillary. And we can stick that in our little chamber. Maybe. See where that chamber is. And if I line up the camera, maybe you can see that that's in there, I hope, through the magnifying glass. And right now we're at 30, so we can crank that a little bit more, maybe between 1.5 to get us up close to 80. And I'm going to actually pound that down just a little bit more. Try to get it more tightly packed. Behave itself a little bit better. Yeah, it's looking nice in there now. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. Alright, meanwhile, we'll work on the tryptamine, which boils up around 130. And it's pretty finely packed too. In this case, since there's so little of it, I'm not going to transfer that to a watch glass. I'm just going to stick my tube directly in. And just tap that down. Again, we got a nice kind of little bit, 4 or 5 millimeters. Stick that one in here. And that one's a nice fine powder. Maybe you can see, maybe not. And this one has to heat up to about 130, so I'm going to crank that up to between 2 and 3. I think that'll probably be about the right setting. And we'll watch that rise. We'd like it to be rising at about 2 degrees per minute when we hit the melting point. That's usually optimum for collecting a melting point. So the cinnamic acid, though, is kind of light and fluffy. I need to crunch that up and make that much more of a uniform powder in order to get a good melting point, so it'll pack nicely in the capillary. So we're just going to grind that around as much as we can. Probably not worth putting it in a mortar and pestle. although that would be a way of getting it really nicely round. And I got plenty of this, so I can afford to transfer some of that to a watch glass. And you can see how light it is. It's attaching itself to everything. And kind of crunch that up a little bit more. And this one I am going to throw down the capillary. Let that bounce around. Give that a good tap. And there it goes. A little bit more in there. That's maybe 6 millimeters, but that should be good enough. Don't want to put too much in because then your melting point range expands. So I'm actually going to sit this one in here. The vanillin is over on the far left. I'm going to put the cinnamic acid over on the right because there's 3 slots in there. If I can find it. Should be able to find that right-hand slot. Right. Having a hell of a time finding it. There it is. Alright, so we got 2 samples in there. We got the vanillin on the left and we got the cinnamic acid on the right. And we're up at around 35. I'm going to crank that up now to 2. And this one's at 40, so obviously they need to be cranked a little bit more. We'll crank that one up to 4. Stick that one up at 2.5. Try to get those rising. So I have the tryptamine over here. I expect that to melt somewhere around 130, 131. The left-hand sample here, the vanillin, I expect to melt somewhere around 80-ish, 85. And then the cinnamic acid on the right should melt at around 118, if I remember correctly. So while we're waiting for those to rise, we also want to create our mixtures for mixture melting point. And what we'd like to do for that is we'd like to basically add a little bit of the pure material to our stuff. And what we'll be looking for is whether addition of that pure material causes our melting point to change. If they're not the same compound, then when we add a little bit of the pure material, we would expect, if there's a mismatch, the melting point to lower and to broaden. So typically when you're making a mixture melting point, you want, a 3 to 4 to 1 mixture of your compound to the adulterating substance that you're putting in there to mix it. So I have some of my vanillin, and I want to take some of the stock vanillin, using the end that I didn't contaminate, and I'm just going to put in about maybe a third as much of the stock vanillin as I had of my compound. So I'm making somewhere around a 3 to 1 mixture. And then I'm going to mix that well. So I get a uniform mix. And then once we actually have the melting point for the pure materials, we'll take a melting point of that as well. Same thing for the cinnamic acid. So I want to take some stock cinnamic acid using the end that I didn't contaminate. And we just want to add some of that. See how much more powdery that is. So again, we're trying to make about a 3-to-1 mixture or so, roughly. And then we're going to mix those well. Grind those together. I would actually like that to be ground more, so I'm going to use a mortar and pestle from one of the KBR kits instead of just using the watch glass, so I can get a nicer mix. I'll just grind that up a little bit. I'm not going quite as crazy on the grinding as I was when I was making the IR pellet, but I am trying to get a nice kind of powder. Scrape that back out onto the watch glass. See how it got a little sticky. Definitely not the best behaved solid in the world. Put that into a nice little pile that I'll be able to get into my melting point capillary. Let's take a look and see what we're doing here. We're up to 50 on this one. We're up to 95 on that one. So those temperatures are reasonable. Nothing has changed inside. Nothing has changed inside this one. And then for the tryptamine, you see that the commercial tryptamine is actually yellow, so it's obviously less pure than ours. I'll dump the rest of that tryptamine out there since this is the last thing we need to do with it. And again, I'm trying to generate about a 3-to-1 mixture or so of the commercial sample with my material. And I want to mix that up well so that it's uniform. That should be enough. Get that into a melting point capillary. Oops. Just trying to scrape a little bit more of this out of there. Alright, so we're up around 55. This one's up around 105. Still no change. Get out 3 more melting capillaries. This is our mixture of vanillin. Drop that down there. So we got a nice little piece at the bottom. E-cinnamic acid. Looks pretty good. And the tryptamine. So I can actually put the tryptamine sample in with the pure one. Oh, that one has melted. Well, I wasn't looking. It's at about 120. And it is not quite fully melted. There's definitely some liquid in there. It looks like it melted between about 120 and 122, which is a little lower than we anticipated. I'm going to let that cool again, and then I can put the other sample in. And over here we're at 60, and still no change in appearance of those two compounds. So we'll raise this just a little bit, up close to 3. This one I've lowered to between 2.5 and 3, so I'll let that cool down. Actually, I can probably just turn it off to let it cool. So I have my 3 samples ready with my mixtures. There's my vanillin and the cinnamic acid and the tryptamine. If you look at the ruler here, right, I've measured that between, it's about 3 millimeters.